Good afternoon. I'm Suzette Kent, and welcome to From Compliant to Cyber Ready, Closing the Gap. Today, I'm excited to moderate a panel with some fantastic panelists who all represent agencies that have some of the most valuable perspective on today's cyber environment. Although the bar is high on readiness and compliance, we always have to be ready, and extraordinary resiliency in these times is critical. So thank you so much for agreeing to join to my panelists. First, I have Nick Andersen, the Executive Assistant Director for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Tony Brannum, who is the CISO at USDA. And then Manuel Medrano for the Department of State. So three gentlemen who are focused on this topic every day. Thank you again for joining. I am going to start with Nick and just ask him to tell you a little bit about what he does every day before we jump into our questions. So Nick, again, thank you for joining.
Thank you so much. It's great to see you again and great to participate here with everybody today. And good afternoon to everybody who's joining us for this. I guess I'll start by telling you just a little bit about CISA. CISA, or the Cybersecurity and Information Security Agency, the Infrastructure Security Agency. We serve as the nation's cyber defense agency and the nation's coordinator for all things critical infrastructure security and resilience. I have the honor of leading our cyber mission and all of our workforce therein. It gives us an expansive mission covering both our .gov infrastructure within the federal family, as well as our critical infrastructure or private sector owner-operators that are out there. So it gives us an opportunity to look at where we can upskill and where we can uplift across the board to better protect government assets and protect citizen services and provide that level of assurance to citizens that have put a high level of trust and confidence in the government's ability to protect their data, but also to work with the types of services that are being delivered in our homes and keeping our communities safe and resilient. So thanks again for having me.
Fantastic. And Tony, tell us about the CISO role at USDA.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Suzette. It's great to be part of this panel. So again, I'm Tony Brannum. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for the Department of Agriculture. So we have a unique mission. So as we like to say, we feed the world. We definitely feed America. So anywhere from, many people know about the SNAP program, to protecting the food supply. So USDA is really involved in many different aspects of food, agriculture. It's actually really large for the sector risk management for us overall. But some of my day-to-day activities overall provide departmental governance and risk and compliance. And what does that mean is we're just making sure we're compliant with federal laws and regulations, but then also the operational security from a SOC perspective for the department. And so whether it's providing home loans, providing overall, cybersecurity for that, for the food supply, for SNAP, for the threats, we do a little bit of everything. And so it's really a unique opportunity within USDA and the breadth of that we do, that we get to see many different aspects of cybersecurity.
Thank you. I know when I was federal CIO, having the opportunity to go out in the field with members of the USDA, I was actually amazed at how wide the breadth of mission is there. So Nick is going to represent protecting the nation, Tony feeding the nation, and Manuel, those were some high bars. I'm going to ask you if you would tell us a little bit about your role at the Department of State.
My name is Manuel Medrano, just like you said, and I work for the U.S. Department of State. So I lead the Security Operations Center. This is our cyber monitoring and incident response for all of state, to include our domestic operations and also our overseas operations. So as you can tell, it's quite a challenge, but also a lot of opportunities. It is a really, really fun portfolio. Other sections that I also lead at the State Department include our penetration testing, our exposure management team, and then we also provide support to the insider threat program from a technology perspective.
Thank you, Manny. And now let's jump right into the question. So let's start with what our panel is named. Many federal agencies report that they're compliant, but what does compliant really mean in today's threat landscape? And why do we have to actually be more than compliant. So Nick, since CISA is one of the ones making the rules in these spaces, or at least making sure that we understand them very well, I'm going to start with you.
Well, I don't think that compliance is really enough anymore. You know, when we look back at when I started working in cybersecurity back in the day, there was a fairly firm checklist of things that you followed, and we had the luxury of abiding by, you know, Patch Tuesday, and here's my update schedule, and here's my regular maintenance, and here's where I'm going to take the environment down to complete that. Uh, to be able to move at the speed of mission and to be able to even remotely compete with the speed at which our adversaries are moving, compliance simply isn't enough anymore. You know, being able to build in the resilient building blocks that are going to allow for compromise to occur, because compromise is going to occur, but being resilient to the fact that when it does occur, we want to be able to minimize damage and minimize the ability for lateral movement within the environment. That's really what's most important. And I think for that, you really have to commit to secure design principles, and you have to be able to, you know, engage in a more rigorous understanding of what is your asset availability and what is your investment life cycle, you know, and what is the overall risk approach that you're taking for your agency. I mean, there can't just be one level of risk tolerance within an agency. You know, you really need to have a firm understanding of the missions that are supported by each of your assets, and then being able to start make decisions from there about your investment profile to buy down that risk within, you know, within the environment. Compliance just isn't going to get us there. It takes a much more engaged mindset and a much more collaborative mindset, I think, from cybersecurity and technology executives to be able to engage as part of that deliberative process, along with agency and department leadership, or within the private sector with the board and their other executive leadership, in order to be able to reach across the board informed decision about mission impact, which again, compliance just can't get you there.
Thank you. Well, so Tony, I'm going to come over to you with so many broad missions, and often what Nick said, it's not just a checklist. How are you thinking about what is beyond compliance in today's environment?
So that's a great question, and I really appreciate Nick's response. So really, compliance is really, to me, it's kind of the baseline, the minimum. And where do we start from? Do we meet it? Because in today's environment, threats change so quickly, whether it's a ransomware or some other sophisticated attacks. You know, compliance really just checklist based. And so as we look at how do we protect, you know, our financial systems or the SNAP program, we have to be constant in how we're monitoring, how we're reacting, whether we're partnering with CISA, we're partnering with our industry partners. How do we really have advanced threat detection to be able to go beyond compliance? Because really compliance in today's age is just a point in time. And so as an executive, if we're just looking at it, yes, we were compliant 2 months ago when I got audited, but what about today? What about next day? And so really we have to be really resilient in how we're going about it. Investing in resilience, detection, and response is really the next step beyond just being compliant.
All right, thank you. Now I'm gonna actually take that question. And this next question is gonna go to Manuel and then Tony. We just talked about going beyond compliance, and that compliance sets the bar for a minimum, but that is the basic bar. So how should agencies and those who are listening and watching think about prioritizing investments in resilience beyond just checking that box, hitting that checklist for traditional compliance? So Manny, I'm going to start with you.
This is like a question that usually comes up a lot. And I think that resilience is definitely something that we're talking a lot about today. And then also compliance, right? And as I've been in security for over 6 years now, what I've actually prioritized is that you got compliance, but then you also have the operational security as well. So those two need to meet together as well. Along with resiliency, right, is that there's a lot of change. Threat actors are changing their tactics. We are involving more and more technology as well. We're adapting technology faster. Technology is moving really fast. And at the overall, right, we have to enable the mission. So then that turns to being resilient as a team and then be able to be resilient as an organization. Along with, I totally agree with the compliance components where you also have some binding operations. You've got some executive orders that we have to comply that are coming from OMB, from CISA, from other places. And that also is important, right? It's part of the business components of cybersecurity to make sure that you're tracking and being compliant with those directives. And then you have the other part, which is the operational cybersecurity, which is the security engineering, the pen testing, monitoring, incident response, right? And those two have to meet together. So it's not just compliance and it's not just operational cyber defense, it's both together.
All right. Now, Tony, from the USDA perspective, what does that look like when you're considering your investment portfolio?
So if we're looking at our portfolio, we're really looking at, compliance is the mindset for our baseline. And it's not really our goal. While we want to be 100% compliance with NIST and FSMA that are required, we're just looking at how do we baseline our investments, but then beyond that, how do we prioritize capabilities into our operations so that we can continue to operate after cyber events such as recovery, redundancy, response, automation. We really look at how can we continue to integrate threat modeling and risk assessments into our spending, concentrating on high impact areas like we've done in the last few years, like zero trusts, cloud security, as we've really gone to cloud, and then supply chain resilience. And it's like, for example, like supply chain resilience. Over the past few years, we really had to look at chips. It's been a big thing in the news. Where are the chips coming from? How do we change our investments? Where do we buy from? Those are really things that we're really prioritizing as we look at not just investment, but where are we doing our buys from as well. And so from that perspective, we're really tracking metrics that demonstrate effectiveness of results in investment, where we get our best return on investment, and really how does that resilience reduce our long-term cost, the ability to say, all right, if we realize this risk, this investment really offsets that. And so that's really the thing that we're looking at, really beyond just those investments for compliance, but really the resilience and maturity beyond that. And this really how we're trying to evolve is where do we put our best investment to evolve in cyber threats, and where do we start to focus that?
Yeah, that's a great point of not just thinking about what you're buying, but where you're buying it from and that supply chain. Well, that kind of helps take us to our next question. I'm going to start with you, Nick, and then go to Tony and Manuel. Tony mentioned threat modeling and talking about supply chain changes, but how are some of the nation state actors like China and others embedding themselves into federal networks, approaching attacks differently, and what does that imply for agencies? Nick?
Well, I think we are blessed
That's a
with
big
having,
sigh there.
and it is a large demand signal that we see regarding the activity that nation state threat actors like China continue to persist with in the environment, both in the federal and non-federal space. But we are blessed with having an adversary that is open and honest with us about their intentions, and I think it's on us to take them seriously. We have seen not just the geopolitical articulation of their goals and their aims, but we've seen the technical articulation of what they do, and we see lots of reporting, both from CISA, from other agencies, from private sector organizations about the types of activity they see within our networks. Now, what does that imply for agencies? I think that implies that the threat is very real. We've released, I've only been in the seat now a hair over 3 months, and we've already released multiple emergency directives related to risk that we see within our supplier ecosystem of vulnerabilities that are being exploited. Many times when we're conducting an incident response with agencies, no matter the threat actor, we're seeing that there are vulnerabilities that are years old that are being exploited. There's activity that we can see that didn't just pop up last week. I think that sort of long-term awareness of this is a real operating environment. Each of us is operating right now in the front lines of a war that has not been declared within cyberspace, and we need to continue to operate like we have an adversary that is continuing to try to penetrate our defenses each and every day. They are not waiting for a vulnerability to be announced and to exploit it, opportunistically. It requires our 100% full-time engagement day in and day out in order to be able to have a fighting chance. And I think here at CISA and other agencies across the federal government, we're committed to doing that. But it really is a group effort where it's going to require that unity of effort to move forward, because a compromise at one agency, ultimately introduces untold risk across the rest of the federal family.
That's right. Well, so you didn't get that 90 days to ease in day-to-day battle. Well, Tony, I know on the USDA side, it is day-to-day battle. Share with the listeners a little bit about what the threat actors implications are at USDA.
I mean, the threat actors implication is real, as Nick said, and it's really cognizant upon all of us kind of look at this. For us, it's really about how do we continue to have good cyber hygiene, how we follow best practices for zero trust, because we know that just from the last two EDs, that came out from CISA, that we had to respond to those as well. And so that we know that the threat actors are out there. And so we always have to go from the culture of we have to assume breach, because a lot of the things that we have within the food supply sector, we know is one of those high risk areas that we've been following over the past couple of years. So we continue to monitor that. We look at how do we really fundamentally change some of our design of our systems, whether it's our financial systems or our food inspection systems. Those are really the compliance areas that we're looking at. It's just not compliance, but continual investment. And as we continue to look at that, and as we start to look at it, how do we do recovery quicker as those capabilities? Because we do know that with the potential of threats that we may have to shut down, we may have to remediate. What does that look like? How do we not let those threats shut down our core mission? This is really what we're trying to look at as we look at where do our threat actors deploy and employ, and then how do we react? And so we have to be able to move quickly as we go forward, and that's one of our core tenets is how can we move quickly without impacting the American public?
That's fantastic. Thank you. Manuel, you have partners around the world, but also adversaries. Could you share with us what that implies specifically at the Department of State?
Well, let me start first by saying that I am not confirming that the Chinese or anyone else is currently embedded into State Department's networks. So I'll start with that. But with that said, right, we always operate, right, in a environment, right, where we are being targeted by many threat actors. And also, I mean, State Department is one of the most targeted civilian agencies of the government, right? So that that basically puts us on a more of a threat on high alert, right? To be looking for those that might be embedded for malicious activity, right? Then also, the other things that we're also working on, right, to kind of like bring more of that real-time monitoring to our networks, right? That includes continuous monitoring, right, for any data exfiltration, mitigate vulnerabilities. Threat actors have shifted more to vulnerability exposure as well, right? So there's just a lot of operation that that are ongoing activities at the State Department when it comes to the State Department's cyber defense.
All right, so I'm going to go back again, Tony. I keep jumping off of something that you said, but you're helping us segue into the next questions. You mentioned recover quicker, so I'm going to start with you, then go to Nick, and then Manuel. When an attack does happen, and you're trying to recover that mission, and you have to rapidly recover at scale, what are some of the things that you do? What are some of the things that are top of mind for continuity of mission critical operations?
Some of the things we've done over the last couple of years, we're really trying to build up our process on how we do like tabletop exercises as a department, just not one component. So how can we do this at scale? And really, because we have so many different unique mission agencies within the department, as we do this, what does this really look like? Are we prepared? Does each agency have their own continuity plans for recovery? Do they understand what their high value assets are? How do we recover? Can we do automated recovery processes that, for example, to restore data and services without manual intervention? The more manual intervention we have, the longer it's going to take. Do they have redundancy, and backup systems in place as part of their core systems? And do they have detailed incident response plans? Is really what we're looking at. As we go through this, what are our core gaps? And how do we start to mitigate that? How do we bridge that gap to mitigate the damage in the recovery? And so as we really start to look forward, is we really do quite a bit of exercise on continuity of operations for our critical operations. We want to have more resilience instead of just traditional compliance. That way, we're very flexible in how we go forward with our capabilities. And so as we start to look at this, how do we continue to integrate our threat model and risk assessments into our spending and concentrate on high impactors like zero trust again, our cloud security and our supply chain resistance? Really go back to those core things on how do we do this at scale. So back to, you asked earlier about our investments. This goes directly into our investments each year. What's the most important things as we go forward?
Yep. Thank you. Nick, I know from conversations that we have had in the past, taking a risk mindset, it is something that's just core to how you approach work. But when an attack happens, what does that rapid recovery at scale look like to you from your vantage point at CISA?
For us, I think it's really about having these capabilities that either we can scale to be federal government wide solutions, or solutions that, to Tony's point, can be well exercised in advance at the department and agency level to have a good understanding of what does recovery look like and what do the procedures look like. I think one of the elements that we've been encouraging people to take a more proactive approach with is not just looking at their own recovery operations, but extending that to further into the supply chain, like Tony mentioned. But outside of the supply chain, within the wider industrial base, I don't want to know that if I have a natural disaster, let's just move off of cyber attacks for a month. If I have a natural disaster or I have a at scale cyber attack, I need to be able to know that my energy generation facility that I'm counting on for energy at my backup site is going to be available. And I need to have a conversation with my telecommunications providers and our water sector providers, because I'm going to need chilling within the data center and so forth and so on. It's a much more broad conversation about how do I identify all of those interdependencies that are associated with continuity of operations and recovery. How do I map that out? And we have a great opportunity to be able to help people scale those types of services internal to their agency from here at CISA and provide some assistance in doing so. But again, it's about having the broader conversation with the largest ecosystem possible to make sure that there's no assumption that hasn't been challenged when you're looking at your recovery operations.
That's fantastic. So Manny, Tony talked about expanding to a department-wide recovery approach, and Nick really pushed the boundaries of going kind of into that supplier and your partner and industrial base chain. What does that recovery at scale look like for the Department of State, and what new things are you thinking about?
The best way is to ensure operational resilience in the wake of a cyber event. That's what preparation is. So that involves solid, comprehensive, standing operation procedures that are up to date and trained to the staff. I know that's not sounds so sexy, because when you're in incident response, sometimes your adrenaline kicks in, right? But it's very important that we prepare and we have those what I call not so fun, sexy things to do in place, right? Because it's extremely important. Now, folks like policymakers, right? Privacy staff, budget, and others all need to have specific roles and be ready and prepare when we need to call in for that standard operating procedure to take effect. As again, what I would like to say, and I keep mentioning this a lot in many places, is that resiliency is a team effort. It's not just one, it's multiple people from multiple portfolios coming together, right, to make sure that it's just to respond. Second, as well, is to immediately be able to mitigate that risk and then recover, because the overall mission is to enable the operations of the organization.
Gentlemen, let's stay on that topic of recovery. You've actually already kind of hinted at parts of this question, but how can agencies proactively test and improve their resilience before an actual attack happens? Tony, I'm going to start with you because you talked about doing tabletops department wide. What are some of the other things that you actually do in USDA to test and improve resilience?
Well, some of the things that we do is part of it's our technology that we have. We do continuous monitoring, but then also continuous threat assessments of our environment, whether there's like web servers or a partnership from CISA and information that they give us. So they're continuously scanning our environments. We're doing internal scans ourselves. Well, these are some of the things that we look at in terms of um, threat monitoring. And I think it's really about in terms of continuous threat assessments. So one of the things that we do is how do we do continuing threat assessments? And it's just not an annual assessment like you're doing a FISMA audit. That's not frequent enough, right? If you just
Yep.
wait annually, well, by the time you do it annually, it's already done. So
Sure, yeah.
we've talked about for years, how do you do a continuous monitor? How do we perform similarly to cyber attacks? So like, for example, we may do, monthly or bi-weekly spam, like phishing attacks on our user base to see how they respond. Because as I say, us as end users, we're the biggest threat to our environments. And so these are sort of the things that are small things that you have to continue to do, and you start to refine your recovery processes and vulnerabilities and your incident response plans. You go through, understand what your communication gaps are, and then start to build leadership. And so these are some of the things that we start to look at as we start to invest more into our threat detection technologies that allow us to do this, but then train our staff at the same time. And so we're to continuously evaluate, update our security measures. And really, this is people, processes, and technology that allow us to do this every year. And so it's not one or the other. We can't just be stuck on one leg.
That's great. So testing the unexpected so you can identify the gaps. Manny, I'm going to go to you next and talk about what are some of the things that the Department of State does proactively to prove their resilience before an incident occurs.
There are multiple methods for testing resilience. I've already mentioned before about some of like the guidelines, the procedures that we have in place, but we also do a lot of tabletop exercises. And there is a compliance requirement that you have to do these exercises every so often. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to do it, follow only the number of times a year. You can do more than those, depending on what your mission requires. The great tool is for readiness. You have to be ready. Penetration testing is also another one, right? The good guys can use the tools and methods similar to the bad guys to find exploitable holes and then allowing those to be mitigated. Red and blue assessments are similar, identifying vulnerabilities and gaps for mitigations. The system authorization process is also an outstanding tool and process to ensure appropriate documentation and measures that are in place when a system that initially goes into production is periodically checked after that, right? Which is called continuous monitoring. And all of these things that I just talked about, right, these items combined, each contribute to the comprehensive approach. And that's why you can have a lot of tabletop exercises for incident response, but also there's a lot of other exercises, improvements, tests that you can have that include proactive or preventable methods and controls so that way we don't end up in incident response on a constant basis.
All right. And Nick, we're going to have you play cleanup batter on this question because you have roles across the government as well as across private sector in this space. What are some of the things that you like to see done or you think are leading practices around testing and improving resiliency before something happens?
Well, I think that the greatest thing is simply visibility into your own environment and understanding of your own environment, whether that's taking advantage of free services that CISA provides, which to your point, it's federal government for us, it's state, local, tribal, territorial governments, it's the private sector that we provide those services to. And it really is a tremendous suite of services that people can go onto CISA.gov and see all of the free services that we provide. So I think those are good opportunities to proactively get that visibility and understanding of your own risk profile. I think beyond that, I think it's part of the approach that we take is we are making a push internally for further intelligence-driven operations. We want to have a study and an understanding of the adversary and what their typical tactics, techniques, and procedures are, and then use those to red team our own defensive measures to be able to say, if this adversary that we're concerned with, that we see operating within a federal environment or throughout the private sector, was to make a move against these types of assets, what does the intelligence tell us? They're the means they would use to actually achieve that. And do we think we have a reasonable degree of resilience associated with that? So we want to proactively take those steps and then look at what are the right levers that we have to pull in order to be able to mitigate that set of circumstances they may hope to achieve.
Yeah, so data-driven hypervigilance there. Good. So we're gonna on the, kind of wrap up around a little bit of the people side, and Manny, I'm going to start with you. As we think about the topic of this session, how we move from compliance to cyber ready, and the things that we do to close the gap. Let's leave the audience with thoughts around what cultural or leadership kind of mindset changes that are necessary to move agencies to thinking about resilience and recovery all the time and not just checking the boxes. So, Manny, we'll start with you.
It comes back to it's a cultural mindset, right? And I think that there is, I would say that I do accept, right, the premise of this question, absolutely, but I do not believe that we're in either or situation. Like I said earlier, compliance and operational resilience, right, are together. They have to work together. They're not separate from each other. But when they are, right, and basically we got OMB who has shown a willingness to adjust, for example, the M2131 requirements as an example, right? I am not the best fan of M2131, and I also recognize that that is at least something to start with in terms of what logs to collect. Now, right, is like, okay, so how do we redefine this? And now what OMB has done is engage agencies throughout the Federal CISO Council, which our CISO is part of that and representing, and soliciting input in terms of what M2131 requirements are needed for the purpose of, in this case, incident response and cyber monitoring, because that is the whole point or the whole purpose of M2131, right? I know that sometimes we have compliance and we're like, well, we have to be compliant. And then we say, well, what about actual security resiliency, right? And operational resiliency. And I think that more and more throughout the years, these two have come closer and closer together, where before they were used to be more and more apart as well. But I think what I just talked about is a great example, right, of the M2131 of the process working. You got both established guidelines and those responsible for compliance that have a voice in the process, which is good. And the most important thing is that we have a shared objective, the mission, ensuring the operational continuity of the agencies and protecting our national security data, regardless if it's operational resiliency or if it's compliance. Both are playing roles.
All right, Tony, on the USDA side, culture and leadership changes. What are you thinking about?
So I think this is a great topic and great question. So one of the things I think about is, we can't just be scorecard driven anymore because there's not enough in cybersecurity. It can't be just compliance, whether it's the FISMA scorecard or we get, yes, we meet all the check marks for NIST and we can get our authorities to operate. So that's just a point in time. It really has to be a culture shift. And I think one of the things across federal government, we really have to change is, how do we make the NIST guidelines and the guidance we get from CISA more adaptable for the way we actually do cyber operations and protect our environment? How can we make it more flexible and resilient to really address those sort of things? This will really change the culture of how we do cybersecurity and how we report up and make it valuable to the department and the constituents we support. But then from a leadership perspective, how do we communicate this? What is the real value of cybersecurity? How do we get away from the cultural mindset of it's just I gotta be on my scorecard? No, that I check mark. No, but that's not enough. The thing is, how are we securing our environments and what are our investments going to us? I think that's really how we're shifting. So even though for USDA, for example, we had our highest Christmas score last year. Well, that's great, except we know that's not enough. And so
Right.
we have to continue to adapt every year. And really, that's the change that we really want to drive in our cybersecurity program. How do we really become more secure all the time and just not at a point in time? And so we have to be very diligent about that. So I think that's really the mindset, is that, as Nick or someone said earlier, it's not a matter of when we're going to get compromised, but when we do, then how do we respond to it? That's really the risk management piece of it and the resilience piece of it. We really have to change the leadership that it's going to happen. We know it's going to happen, but how do we recover from it quickly with minimum impact?
All right. So never stop moving forward. Nick, in one of the previous questions, you talked about the fact that your remit is actually the federal government, state government, tribal, private sector. When you think that's a pretty broad base, but what are some of the cultural and leadership changes that you see as necessary for us to never stop and stay hypervigilant?
Well, to Tony's point, I think it's not about being scorecard driven and being compliance driven. You know, one of the conversations I have with my cyber team here is this isn't about protecting a box that has data on it. This is about, you know, honoring the commitment that we have to the American people, and this is about, you know, making sure that our communities stay safe and resilient with the essential services that they've come to rely on. So our goal when we think about resilience should just be being able to keep your head held high when you're talking to your family and talking to your neighbors, knowing that you did your job and you did your part in order to continuously deliver safe and secure citizen services and to make sure that the essential services that we rely on for our lives are still available when they're called upon. You know, we really have to be able to shift that mindset from I'm just protecting ones and zeros on a box. When we start talking about the investment that's required for our technology, we really have to start thinking about this like it's crumbling roads and bridges. I mean, if Americans saw the equivalent age of some of the technology that's being used to provide these essential services and compared it to traditional infrastructure within our communities, I think we'd have a very different conversation about the types of investment outlays that we needed to see in our technology. But it's significant. And then asking people to be willing to make a significant investment, we have to make significant mindset shifts and sort of what that level of accountability and responsibility is that we should bear in providing those services.
Yeah. Nick, I think that's a great visual, is kind of thinking about a crumbling bridge and taking that same level of intensity towards how you fix it. On behalf of Team Rubrik and the conference um, managers, I want to say thank you to all of the panelists. Thanks for letting me ask you questions and go on the journey with you. I just in recapping, you each shared some things that I hope our audience takes away, and maybe just the last fine points, keeping your mind on the mission and remember who we're serving, whether it's the safety of our nation, feeding the population, or how we interact with the rest of the world. It's not a checklist. And we heard in your answers many times, never stop preparing for what's going to be next. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and appreciate those who are listening. And I hope you made great notes.